This hour on I-24 News, despite a unanimous UN vote calling for a ceasefire, the Syrian regime continues to bomb rebel-held Ghouta. Dozens of more people have been killed, including a child who had died in another alleged chemical attack.
Palestinian militant group Hamas is calling for another intifada over Israel's decision to enforce tax collection on church property in Jerusalem.
And the sheriff in Broward County, Florida, is facing growing calls to resign. He acknowledges that several of his deputies failed to enter the school during the shooting, including a school security officer who worked there.
I gave him a gun. I gave him a badge. I gave him the training. If he didn't have the heart to go in, that's not my responsibility.
From the I-24 News studios in Times Square in New York, this is Crossroads with David Schuster and Tal Heinrich.
2 days after the United Nations voted unanimously for a ceasefire in Syria, the Syrian regime continues to attack rebel-held areas, including Ghouta.
Nearly 500,000 people remain trapped inside that city. At least 24 people were killed in new airstrikes over the weekend, bringing the death toll over the last 8 days to more than 500 people. That's including dozens of children.
Russia's President Vladimir Putin, whose representatives voted in favor of the UN resolution, has now called for a humanitarian pause in the fighting. Putin supports the Assad regime, but says civilians should be allowed to get out of harm's way. Correspondent Emily Rose has more.
It was the ceasefire that was doomed to fail. After the UN Security Council unanimously agreed on a ceasefire resolution Sunday, following 3 days of intense negotiations, the violence intensified.
Security Council resolutions are only meaningful if they are effectively implemented. And that is why I expect the resolution to be immediately implemented and sustained.
After a week of relentless airstrikes, killing hundreds of civilians, the ground offensive began on Monday. Syrian forces and rebels clashed on multiple fronts as the world pointed fingers at Russia.
There is a special responsibility, especially from the three guarantors of the Astana process, Russia, Iran and Turkey, to make sure that the process of de-escalation takes place and not the process of escalation.
But the ceasefire had no specified start date, only that it would begin, quote, without delay, and there were no details on how it would be enforced. The U.S. and Russia stand in opposition to one another, making it almost impossible to enforce the resolution. The Kremlin affirmed Monday the agreement does not apply to groups affiliated with al-Qaeda or the al-Nusra Front, which the Kremlin claims are at large in Ghouta.
We know that the terrorists in eastern Ghouta are not laying down their weapons. They are holding the local population as hostages. This is the cause of a very tense situation.
Meanwhile, the Syrian civil defense claimed a poisonous gas attack struck the Damascus suburb. But Russia denied the allegations.
I want to remind you that yesterday Russian officials have already warned about such provocations, and surely there will be more false stories. And we know where these stories will be coming from. They'll be coming from social media.
Shortly after, the Russian defense minister said that Russian President Vladimir Putin called for daily humanitarian corridors in eastern Ghouta for civilians to leave. While the UN reached a consensus to bring hope to the Syrian people, eastern Ghouta has become what the UN Secretary General deemed hell on earth for the some 400,000 residents trapped inside the rebel-held enclave. It seems the road to hell on earth is paved with good intentions. Emily Rose, I-24 News.
For more, we're joined by senior diplomatic correspondent Nina Larson. Nina, so what happened since Saturday's vote at the Security Council? Basically zero implementation on the ground?
Basically, Tal, I mean, you saw those awful pictures there. There is no ceasefire on the ground in Syria at the moment. And we had this development today whereby Russia said that they were going to have these humanitarian pauses of about 4 or 5 hours a day. But people on the ground are saying, look, this is ridiculous. You can't bomb us for the rest of the day and then have this alleged pause. And we can't deduct that this is going to be real either, because the Syrian army has now gone in on the ground.
And so in other words, you have Putin saying a 5-hour delay, a 5-hour pause each day, even though Russia supported this 30-day ceasefire over the weekend?
Yes, absolutely. We can only imagine that this is after pressure from Emmanuel Macron of France and Angela Merkel of Germany. They had a rare joint phone call to Putin saying, look, you've got to help us implement this, and this is what we've come up with. But you saw the Russian foreign minister there saying that you couldn't rely on reports from social media. We have the added complication of reports of a fresh chlorine attack over the weekend. And it's just very difficult to, I won't say verify what's happening on the ground, because we have to rely on social media, but this is what Russia depends on again and again.
And today we got another example of Russia's power, demonstrating its power, and it has to do with a vote on the situation in Yemen.
That's right. There's a great deal of tension, as there usually is, between Russia as the Security Council power and the rest of the Security Council. There was going to be a fairly straightforward resolution today calling out Iran. This was authored by Western powers like the UK, France and the US. It was aimed at calling out Iran's activities in arming Houthi rebels in Yemen. But again, Russia exercised its veto. So there's a bit of a deadlock at the UN. Everyone's tremendously frustrated. Meanwhile, if we go back to Syria, you see how desperate the situation is on the ground.
Indeed. Nina Larson, thank you for this update.
Let's bring in Tony Badran, a research fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. And Tony, why would the Russians, well, first of all, if the Russians would support a UN resolution as they did over the weekend, saying, okay, let's have a 30-day ceasefire, they can't then suddenly come up and say, oh, forget about the ceasefire we just voted for. Now we want this 5-hour pause each day. There's a conflict between this.
Not for the Russians, there isn't. I mean, for them, these ceasefires, quote unquote, since they started playing this game last year with the Obama administration, they've always been, for them and for the regime, an instrument of war. They're not an instrument to, quote unquote, de-escalate, as the parlance has it. It's always a manner to either reallocate sources from one area to another, or simply to give cover for what is essentially a campaign of war crimes, which is what you're seeing right now in Ghouta.
So in your opinion, Tony, does the UN still has any kind of effect in Syria?
No, nothing of consequence that has taken place in Syria in terms of action to stop the Assad regime and his Iranian backers, or even the Russians, has taken place through the United Nations. Because at all times you have Russia there exercising its veto, because it is a participant in the war. It cannot not exercise the veto if it's not something that goes its way, because it is a participant in the actual war. It is a partaker in these war crimes that are taking place. And whatever something of use has happened in Syria, for instance, what we saw last April when the Trump administration struck the Assad regime over its use of sarin gas, that's something that took place outside the United Nations, not through the United Nations.
So the United Nations is essentially worthless in all of this. I mean, there's no meaning behind a vote when Russia doesn't exercise its veto, but then doesn't support the vote that it just cast. It suggests that the United Nations, thanks in part to the Russians, is simply useless.
It's actually worse in certain cases. I mean, you'll see, for instance, some of their aid programs and the like are in fact actually shown to be aiding the Assad regime, actually. So in certain cases, it's even worse than useless. It's actually a participant itself in supporting the Assad regime.
How efficient do you find this idea coming from Russia of creating the humanitarian corridor and allowing people to evacuate of eastern Ghouta? Is that sufficient enough?
This is what I mean by getting UN cover for war crimes. What this is effectively is basically UN-sponsored ethnic cleansing or mass population movement, which is what they did, what they tried to propose the same thing in Aleppo in 2016, for instance. They say, look, there are groups here that the ceasefire does not apply to. And therefore, we're going to continue bombing regardless. If people would like to leave so that we can continue destroying the place over the people we don't like, sure, they can leave their homes and be displaced. This is what the Russians are proposing.
But to be fair, I mean, there are jihadist groups that are mixed in places like Ghouta, so we may hate the fact that they're just bombing the city into submission, that there's no accuracy whatsoever in terms of the Syrian or Russian warplanes. But from their perspective, they are attacking jihadist groups who are opposed to the Syrian regime.
There are the groups of the Nusra Front, what was called the Nusra Front. There's about 300 or so of them dispersed in Ghouta. There were attempts to actually get them out. The people who actually blocked their exit from Ghouta was the Syrian regime itself.
So if the international community is interested in stopping the bloodshed in Syria, where do you think the focus should be? Should we focus on maybe directly trying to put pressure on the Assad regime, maybe even on the rebels in eastern Ghouta, or put more pressure on the Russians?
I think the only thing, like I said, like I mentioned earlier with the strikes in April, the only thing that has gotten the Assad regime to behave in a particular manner is direct action. I don't believe that the UN route is going to be fruitful at all because you'll have the Russian position repeat itself over and over. I think, however, there's another question for the Trump administration for its overall Syria policy here, because the Trump administration has itself outside the Astana agreement, which is what was referenced in your report. Incidentally, Ghouta, part of that agreement, was supposed to be a quote-unquote de-escalation zone. It was supposed to be a place where none of this stuff was supposed to be even happening, which shows you the value of de-escalation zone agreements with Russia. Now, this has actual bearing on the situation in South Syria because there is a agreement for de-escalation zone on the border with Israel that with the Russians and the United States directly, excluding Turkey and Iran. So in this case, if this is the way the Russians and the regime and the Iranians honor these types of agreements, I think we are going to be looking at the possibility of an escalation along the border in southern Syria in short order once the regime cleans out, or if it manages to clean out Damascus, which incidentally will only consolidate Iran's position in Damascus, which will then serve as a launching pad for further operations in the south. So this is all very much a red flag, or should be a red flag, for the Trump administration to adjust its Syria policy accordingly.
Tony Badran, research fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Tony, thank you very much. And it seems tall like a red flag, not just for the United States, but for the entire world. Blood is on the hands of the Russians because of what they have done and what they've allowed the Syrian regime to do. It was totally worthless last week at the UN. All of those delays to try to come up with some ceasefire, and the Russians voted for it but wouldn't support it by asking Assad to follow it.
And thanks, Tony. We are reminded that it was supposed to be a de-escalation zone. We already forgot about that.
Remarkable. Staying in the Middle East, Israel has arrested and charged 3 Arab-Israeli citizens who were allegedly planning to carry out an attack on security forces near the Temple Mount.
Plus, for the second day in a row, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem's Old City has closed its doors in protest over a tax dispute with Israel. In Israel, 3 people have been charged with planning to carry out an ISIS-inspired attack on Jerusalem's Temple Mount holy site.
Police say the suspects were also planning to target a synagogue in Tel Aviv or carry out a vehicle ramming attack. The suspects include 2 men who are both 20 years old and a minor whose identity is being withheld.
Police say they were planning to carry out an attack similar to the one conducted last July, the one that killed 2 Israeli police officers. That incident also sparked a weeks-long crisis after Israel set up metal detectors to enhance security in response to the attack.
Meantime, the militant group Hamas is calling for an intifada over a tax dispute between Israel and Jerusalem's Church of the Holy Sepulchre. A spokesperson for Hamas is blasting an Israeli tax plan and says it's part of a religious war on Palestinians.
On Sunday, church leaders announced they were closing the holy site until further notice in protest of the local government's efforts to collect back taxes on church properties not used for worship. The church is also protesting a draft legislation in the Israeli Knesset to confiscate church land sold to private developers. Correspondent Shelby Weiner has more.
The churches of the Holy Land are banding together to protest both the local and national Israeli government. Their grievances are over new legislation that could require churches to pay up to $200 million in property taxes on commercial real estate, and a new bill that would allow the state to seize land sold by the church to private developers.
These actions breach the existing agreements and the privileges of the churches in what seems as an attempt to weaken the Christian presence in Jerusalem. As a measure of protest, we decided to take this unprecedented step of closure of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre.
The drastic step to shut the holy site led to rare unity between the different churches in Israel. Custody of the Holy Sepulchre is split between several Christian sects, with a reputation for infighting and even violent disputes. Their unison on the protests makes a statement, but it means they're not the only ones with something to lose. This lock remains shut as the church continues its protests, leaving Christian pilgrims outside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where they're unable to see just behind these doors the place of Jesus Christ, crucifixion, and resurrection. Israel is a major destination for religious pilgrims, with nearly 2 million Christian tourists visiting the Holy Sepulchre every year. With the protest in full motion, visitors will be returning home with mixed emotions.
Well, first of all, it feels great to be here. And we know, even though we can't get behind those doors, we still know what took place there. So the feeling is tremendous that we're here, where Jesus was crucified, where he was buried, and where he was resurrected. We know it's here. We just wish the doors were open.
I mean, it would be great to go inside and to see it and to have the opportunity to see everything inside and experience this. I mean, we came from 7,000 miles away to see these things, and you know, it's disappointing. One of those once-in-a-lifetime kind of opportunities. Who knows if we'll get the opportunity to be back here again.
It remains to be seen how the dispute will be settled. Religious and political leaders are holding talks, but it's unclear if a compromise will be reached and if the doors to Jesus' tomb will be reopened anytime soon. Shelby Weiner, I-24 News.
To discuss, let's bring in Reverend Dr. May Ellis Cannon, the Executive Director of Churches for Middle East Peace. And Reverend, we're talking about two different bills here. I would like to start with you talking about the bill that has to do with city taxes, the municipality taxes. Do you think that the Israeli authorities are really biased here? Is it a matter of religion? Are they treating the church in a different way that they would have treated maybe, let's say, a synagogue in Israel?
I think that's a great question. We can't speak to the intent of the Israeli government, but we certainly are deeply concerned and even appalled at the fact that the Jerusalem municipality is seeking to collect these taxes, which historically, according to the status quo, which has been in existence since the 1800s, churches have not had to pay taxes. And so this decision represents a change in the status quo, which is deeply disconcerting to Christians all around the world.
Reverend Cannon, I can understand the frustration that a lot of people may have, but the Jerusalem municipality says that these will not be tax collections on a church. This would be a tax collection on a restaurant or a hotel, which is essentially a commercial enterprise that the church may run or may own.
So I think that's an incomplete truth. The taxes would be applied to anything that is not worship space. So even space outside of a church where people would fellowship, or schools where children have the opportunity to be educated, or social services where churches respond to the needs of the poor, or programs for people with disabilities. All of those programs have been tax exempt and cost an incredible amount of money. And the churches can't afford to do all of those social services and pay the taxes. And in addition, the churches are responsible for paying for the upkeep of the holy sites, which brings in millions and millions of tourists every year. And they don't get a benefit for upkeep of those, all of the maintenance and things of having to host those many tourists, which they are incredibly, welcoming to them. But there's a great cost that the church bears, which was part of why the status quo agreement was established, which my understanding is the Israeli government has agreed to it since the time of the establishment of the State of Israel.
Now let's talk a bit about the second bill, because there it's a different story. We're talking about the State of Israel calling to confiscate land that was sold by the church to private owners, right? Can you explain what's going on there? Where does the church stand on this issue? Because it's not your land. It's not the church's land anymore.
Well, I think that's actually a contested issue about whose land it is. I just had a meeting with our board today with Churches for Middle East Peace. So I represent 28 denominations and organizations that are U.S.-based, and our policy positions are unanimous. I do not speak on behalf of the churches in the Holy Land, and so they would need to. We have been following their lead. They've been issuing statements, and we are standing in solidarity with them about this issue. I can say Churches for Middle East Peace and our churches are completely unified that we are deeply, deeply concerned about the issue of land sales. And the cases with the, there's a very contested issue with the Greek Orthodox Church that's actually in a court case right now where they're one party is saying that the land was sold and the Greek Orthodox Church is saying no, that the person who actually signed away the lease, it was not legitimate. And it's a very complicated issue. I'm not an expert on that, but I can say that what we see and what we know and what we're learning about this is deeply disconcerting. So we're hoping to talk to people within the Israeli government, within the Jerusalem municipality, within the American government, and we're calling on Christians around the world to non-violently respond because the future of Christianity in the Holy Land is in peril. I don't quite have words for how significant this is, that our holiest site is so under threat.
Reverend Dr. May Ellis Cannon, thank you so much for explaining this highly disputed issue. And David, I think we should look at it in a, from a greater resolution. It's not only a story of the church and, of course, the Palestinians. They have nothing to do in the story, although Hamas is, allegedly furious about this. They see it as an attempt of the Israeli authorities to take over Jerusalem. But I think it's a different story. It's a story of, paying taxes should apply to everyone. But on the other hand, private land should not be confiscated. And it's the story of property rights in Israel, which is a whole different thing. It's complicated, but we heard the passions that certainly and the Reverend has. And I think this is one issue where maybe people in Israel don't quite get necessarily how passionate Christians around the world are over this particular issue and how this may go much further than just tax policy if Israel isn't careful about it. It's so sad for these tourists that we saw in Shelby's piece. Well, heartbroken parents in Nigeria are pleading with the government for the safe return of their daughters who were kidnapped by Boko Haram militants nearly a week ago. That's coming up. Palestinians were not angry enough about the church. Now there's news involving the U.S. Embassy moving from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. That's expected now to happen much faster than expected. The new date coincides with the 70th anniversary of Israel's founding. Diplomatic correspondent Mike Wagenheim has the story.
A promise or a provocation? The expedited move of the United States Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem has most Israelis and those in the pro-Israel community happy.
This is a great moment for the state of Israel. President Trump's decision to move the American embassy to Jerusalem will make our Independence Day celebrations even happier. Thank you, President Trump, for your leadership and for your friendship.
But the already sensitive issue now has an added twist. The temporary embassy will open in May, a national period of mourning for Palestinian Arabs. U.S. President Donald Trump's State Department announced plans to relocate its Israeli embassy to Jerusalem's Arnona neighborhood in the U.S. Consulate General's Operations Building. The interim embassy will initially provide space only for U.S. Ambassador David Friedman and a small staff, before an annex is added next year to provide additional office space. The search for a permanent embassy site continues. But with the U.S.-led peace process already thrown off kilter by America's recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital, how will the rushed move of the embassy, years ahead of schedule, sit with the Palestinians, especially with the opening coming in May, when Palestinian Arabs mark their Nakba Day, or Day of Catastrophe, coinciding with the formation of the State of Israel.
His decision to expedite the movement of the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem on the day of the Palestinian catastrophe, Palestinian Nakba, reflects a flagrant violation of international law and a flagrant violation of human sensitivities. These are real provocations for all Arabs and Muslims.
Trump's Mideast peace team reportedly says their plan is just about ready. But with Palestinian Arabs seeing the embassy move as another one-sided maneuver, that plan may need to undergo another renovation. Mike Wagenheim, I-24 News.
In Africa, the government of Nigeria is acknowledging that more than 100 girls remain missing nearly a week after Boko Haram militants attacked their town. Frustrated family members already had compiled a list of missing girls after saying Nigerian officials were being slow to respond.
The fate of the girls remains unknown. They were abducted from their school last Monday. Eyewitnesses reported seeing young women taken away at gunpoint.
The school is about 200 miles from where Boko Haram militants kidnapped nearly 300 girls 3 years ago. More than 100 of those girls are still missing. Just ahead, in Washington, there is a debate over the FBI and what was presented to a secret surveillance court that enabled the FBI to do some eavesdropping on a Trump official named Carter Page. A Democratic memo got released over the weekend. It counters the narrative of a Republican memo that was released a few weeks ago.
And President Trump told some of the nation's governors that he will make school safety a top priority in the wake of the school shooting in Florida. There is a growing debate over a newly declassified Democratic memo on the Russia probe that rebuts the GOP document released weeks ago.
That Republican memo alleged that the FBI abused its powers in the Russia investigation during 2016. This new memo from the Democrats aims to debunk those GOP allegations. And now President Trump is weighing in. Correspondent Maggie Rulli has the story.
The battle of memo versus memo has descended into schoolyard taunts.
He's a bad guy.
With President Trump appearing on Fox News slamming the newly declassified memo on the Russia probe written by Democrats and calling out the memo's author, Adam Schiff, the ranking Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee, as a total phony. Schiff firing right back. Wait a minute, Mr. President. Am I a phony or sleazy, a monster or little? Surely you know that the key to a good playground nickname is consistency. Schiff's memo was a point-by-point rebuttal of a Republican memo released weeks ago. That document, written by Republican Congressman Devin Nunes, accuses the Department of Justice of abusing its surveillance powers by basing requests for a wiretap on a Trump campaign associate on an unverified dossier compiled by former British spy Christopher Steele and paid for by the Clinton campaign.
To have a secret court that gets abused like this is totally unacceptable.
But Democrats say their memo debunks those claims, insisting DOJ provided additional information obtained through multiple independent sources that corroborated Steele's reporting. But whatever that corroborating evidence may have been is now blacked out, censored by the White House, which insists releasing the details would compromise national security.
I'm not surprised the White House doesn't like it and tried to bury it because it reveals evidence that goes to the issue of collusion.
That was Maggie Rulli reporting.
Meantime, there's been a new setback to President Trump involving the DACA program. The Supreme Court has declined to hear the administration's efforts to try and end the DACA program.
Trump had intended to shut down the program by March 5th and force Congress to come up with a more permanent solution. Monday's denial now gives Congress more time to come up with a new bill. So far, repeated bipartisan efforts have failed. Trump called the decision by the Supreme Court a sad thing.
You know, we tried to get it moved quickly because we'd like to help DACA. I think everybody in this room wants to help with DACA. But the Supreme Court just ruled that it has to go through the normal channels, so it's going back in, and there won't be any surprise. I mean, it's really sad when every single case filed against us is in the Ninth Circuit. We lose, and then we do fine in the Supreme Court. But what does that tell you about our court system? It's a very, very sad thing. So DACA is going back, and we'll see what happens from there.
Let's bring in senior Washington correspondent Dan Raviv. Dan, do you think now we have a more complete understanding of how the Russia collusion investigation began? It's like...
Oh, because of memo versus memo, Tal? Yeah, I see what you mean. Now, Republicans say the beginnings were bogus. Democrats say the investigations are legitimate. At least this part, why surveillance was ordered against Carter Page, who was a Trump campaign advisor, considered an expert on Russia and energy, though we've learned the FBI thought that Carter Page might have been a Russian agent. But keep in mind, that's not the whole story anyway as to why there is a Russia collusion and Russia meddling investigation. There was the hacking into the Democratic National Committee. There was the leaking of Hillary Clinton campaign emails, the discovery that Russian bots on the internet were placing false ads and even scheduling rallies on this side and that. It's a big sprawling story. Now, to be fair, there still is not proof that anyone in the Trump campaign knowingly colluded with Russia. But the fact is, the special prosecutor Robert Mueller is still investigating, and we've learned that tomorrow, Tuesday, he'll be questioning Hope Hicks, a very close aide to President Trump. Tal and David.
Dan, as part of the effort to perhaps undermine the special counsel in the FBI, you had the Republicans alleging that the FBI didn't act properly in front of the surveillance court. That was the thrust of their argument in their memo. Then you had the Democrats saying, no, there were several different sources of information that encouraged the FISA court to go ahead and give us the warrant so we could do the surveillance. Because of the he said, she said, and all of this, is it politically essentially just a wash?
Well, frankly, I think so. And if you're a Republican and you get your news mostly from conservative media, you're going to think that, oh, there is proof now that the FBI was bad at the beginning of all this, and President Trump is encouraging you to think that. If you're a liberal and you don't trust Trump and the Trump campaign, then you're really glad that the Democrats put out their memo and presented some evidence. Now, President Trump really doesn't like the fact that the Democrats put out their memo when the White House had said there need to be redactions and we're not approving it yet. So the Democrats did their own redactions, and that was Congressman Adam Schiff, the California Democrat, who decided on that. And as we heard in response, the president, maybe not too presidential, said that Adam Schiff, the congressman, is a bad guy and a total phony. David and Tal.
And Dan, let's go back to the DACA issue for a second. What does it mean for the Dreamers, the fact the Supreme Court is deciding to stay out of the dispute for now?
Well, they probably feel good about it that so far 2 federal courts have stopped the Trump administration from removing the protected status of DACA on March 5th. Will there be a new deadline at some point? Well, maybe so, if the president wants to remove that status. Now, keep in mind, the White House has said that the United States government will not try to arrest and evict that 700,000 people. Obviously, the president is trying to use them and the issue as a bargaining chip. He's telling Congress, I will offer DACA protection to those people and even more people if you give me $25 billion for border security, including the wall on the Mexican border, and end the visa lottery, and end most forms of family unification. Well, as you can imagine, Congress is still debating that between Democrats and Republicans. So far, no breakthrough. David and Tal.
Dan Raviv, thank you for this update.
Also on this day, President Trump reaffirmed his calls for teachers to take action on gun control after the Parkland, Florida school massacre.
The president also heard from the nation's governors who criticized some of the president's proposals for protecting schools. Correspondent Kenneth Mutton reports.
President Trump face-to-face with the nation's governors, demanding action to protect schools.
We have to take steps to harden our schools so that they're less vulnerable to attack.
The president's proposal banning bump stocks, which can make a gun more lethal, and raising the minimum age to buy rifles from 18 to 21. The NRA opposes both.
Half of you are so afraid of the NRA. There's nothing to be afraid of. And you know what? If they're not with you, we have to fight them every once in a while. That's okay.
The most controversial part of Trump's plan, arming some educators.
Educators should educate, and they should not be foisted upon this responsibility of packing heat in first-grade classes. We need a little less tweeting here, a little more listening, and let's just take that off the table and move forward.
The debate comes nearly 2 weeks after the Florida school massacre in Parkland. President Trump harshly criticized the response to the shooting. The Broward County Sheriff's Office is investigating claims deputies waited instead of rushing in during the rampage. The school's resource officer, Deputy Scott Peterson, resigned. Video allegedly showed him failing to confront the shooter.
The way they performed was frankly disgusting. I really believe I'd run in there even if I didn't have a weapon. And I think most of the people in this room would have done that, too.
That was Kenneth Moten reporting. Meanwhile, the head of Broward County Sheriff's Office spent much of the weekend dismissing calls to step down.
Scott Israel defended his department's response and said that he should not be held responsible for the actions of an armed deputy, Scott Peterson, who failed to go after the gunman. There are also reports that other deputies may have failed to entered the school during the massacre. Sheriff Israel said that he should not be held responsible for the actions of his armed deputies. Let's bring in our senior national correspondent, Michael Schur. Michael, what are the politics here involving Sheriff Israel, and how much are politics part of this?
You know, you can't help but say the politics are always a part of these things. I mean, we see it from the moment these events happen, the politicizing of guns, the politicizing of blame. And, of course, in Florida, you have the governor, Rick Scott, who's poised to announce that he's going to run for the Senate seat there against Rick Nelson, or at least he was before all of this happened. So there are politics, but there's also the idea that somebody has to answer for what happened. On the law enforcement side, Scott Peterson was the deputy that worked for Sheriff Israel there in Broward County. He was, suspended immediately, and now people are saying, well, maybe it's time to look at Sheriff Israel. Today, Scott Peterson said that he did nothing wrong. He thought that the shots were coming from outside, said this through a lawyer, and now it becomes an investigation. But one important thing, Tal and David, to remember here is that as they look at this, a lot of the gun rights activists are on that side, but a lot of the people that are for gun control are looking at this and saying, we don't want to blame the police. We want to stop it from happening in the first place and not worry so much about what we do after it happens.
The president today, Michael, spoke to governors, as we saw before, and he said there the NRA are on our side. He also said when they are not on our side, it's also fine. We have to fight them once in a while. What else was discussed in this meeting? How did the governors respond to what the president had to say?
I would say the best word for how they responded was predictably. You had Republican governors who wanted to agree with the president here, find little places, for instance, where they could talk about the NRA and the importance of the NRA. One interesting, interaction, we just saw Governor Jay Inslee of Washington State. Right after Governor Inslee, the president took a question or invited comment from Greg Abbott, the governor of Texas. Texas, a state where they arm teachers, where they are pro-NRA. So it's clear that there is a partisan side to this. What they're looking for, these governors, and of course they can't legislate on a federal level, but what they're looking for is a way to find middle ground so that they can say, all right, this would be okay in our state, so that their senators and representatives can represent that in Congress. It still remains to be seen. Today was the first day back for Congress. Nothing got done immediately, but certainly conversations are ongoing.
Yeah, the president is asking Congress to start voting on this literally this week. Members of Congress, as you pointed out, say, no, wait a second, we can't operate on that timetable. But what does it say perhaps about the overall debate in terms of momentum, that there's the president pushing something along?
It's hard to say because you don't know how this White House, operates. In past administrations, you'd say, well, here, they've had a week and a half to sort of strategize how they want to deal with Congress. With this president, it seems like it could be an off-the-cuff remark where he's saying, okay, we just want to press Congress. They have to vote. It's an easy thing for a president to say, but Congress does want to look into this a little bit. But yes, there are people on the president's side, on both sides of the aisle, who said we have to come out of this week having voted on something. So that urgency, while not coming necessarily just from the president, is also coming from leadership in the House and Senate, David.
The president also revealed that over the weekend he had lunch with NRA leaders. Do we know anything about that meeting?
We don't know much about the meeting other than the fact that he was supposed to be talking to them about having to moderate on some issues and that he was going to take another side on some of what they're doing. And I think you saw a hint of that today when he spoke with the governors. But today, the NRA has been dealing with a lot of the boycotting, a lot of companies that are saying that they're not going to now partake in the discounts given to them because they have or that they give to NRA members. And today, Casey Cagle, the lieutenant governor of Georgia, said that he will use that as a threat against Delta. Whenever they want to get something passed, they're going to make it very difficult in the state of Georgia. So this has gone just beyond the business, gone just beyond the NRA. Politicians are trying to figure out how much leverage they have in this case. So the president sat down with the NRA probably to let him know exactly where he stands and where he might actually have a little bit of room between what he believes and what they believe. Tal.
All right. Michael Schur, senior national correspondent. Michael, thanks as always. We appreciate it. Tal, what do you make of these companies, now more than 24 companies that are essentially cutting ties with the NRA, not providing the discounts that they were providing 2 weeks ago?
First, it shows that the NRA is touchable. I think it will be interesting to see whether other companies will follow through, and maybe other companies will do exactly the same, fill in that void that these companies provided members of the NRA with certain benefits.
I wonder if it also speaks perhaps to the sort of magnitude of this whole debate, that people are now using their pocketbooks or their wallets or their credit cards to try to take action with who they shop with and who they travel with because of an organization and whether it has ties to the NRA. It's sort of remarkable thing to see.
Well, China's president has just been granted sweeping new powers. The Communist Party says it's abolishing constitutional limits on presidential terms, effectively allowing Xi Jinping to lead China for as long as he wants.
Plus, thousands of people have lined up to attend the first ever jazz festival in Saudi Arabia. China's ruling Communist Party has proposed a change to the constitution, and it could mean that President Xi Jinping never has to retire.
The plan is facing fierce opposition on social media. Well, David, to the extent Chinese social media, highly regulated, actually allows. But some people do support the change. I-24 News correspondent Marcus White has the details.
It's the latest sign of President Xi Jinping's power grip on China. On Sunday, China's Communist Party proposed removing term limits for the country's president, a move that would allow Xi to remain in power indefinitely. Right now, China's constitution says the president and vice president shall serve no more than 2 consecutive terms. The announcement was made as many people in China returned to work after Chinese New Year celebrations, and the proposal could be approved in a parliamentary session next week. The plan is being met with opposition on social media, with some drawing comparisons to North Korea's ruling dynasty. But many on the streets of Beijing and Shanghai support the idea.
No matter how many terms Xi would stay in office, it would be a good thing for us.
Xi has been paramount for China's economic development.
Xi heads the Communist Party and the military, and early in his presidency, he was declared core leader of the Communist Party. His influence over the party and country was on display late last year. Xi Jinping thought was added to the constitution, making the 64-year-old the most powerful Chinese leader since Mao Zedong. In the 1970s, Mao's successors shifted from a one-man rule towards a consensus system where power was shared by a number of high-ranking officials. Each of Mao's successors served 2 5-year terms in office. But early in Xi's presidency, it was apparent he wanted to lead China past 2023. And with no clear successor among Communist Party leadership, a 3rd term for Xi seems all but assured. Marcus White, I-24 News.
Well, it's a big headline, but David, are you surprised?
I'm not surprised, but there's also a downside because if China's economy suddenly takes a tumble, it's all on Xi Jinping's shoulders. He can't blame anybody else.
Right. And after seeing Erdogan doing it in Turkey, consolidating powers, we have Vladimir Putin in Russia, also Egypt, Sisi coming from China.
It's the world we live in now.
Exactly. Well, now to a different story for jazz lovers. Jazz festivals are common in Europe, the United States, and Middle Eastern countries such as Israel, Egypt, and Lebanon.
But now, Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is joining these countries after it hosted its first jazz festival over the weekend. Our culture correspondent Daniel Campos has more.
Jazz in the Desert Kingdom. The first ever Riyadh Jazz Festival at the International Golf Club sold over 6,000 tickets, according to the organizing company. Surprising even participating musicians.
To be honest, when I was asked to come to Saudi Arabia, I was concerned that they won't understand me and I won't understand them. But really, when I came and played music, I was amazed. I mean, the interaction between me and the audience was wow.
Sponsored by Saudi Arabia's General Entertainment Authority, the festival also included international acts, such as American trombonist Delfiayo Marsalis and British jazz band Incognito. And it showcased the kingdom's recent efforts to detach itself from its conservative image.
I'm so happy. I got up from bed this morning and went to a jazz festival and performed in front of a crowd like me, my countrymen. It's a feeling I just cannot explain to you.
Jazz diplomacy isn't a new concept. During the Cold War, the U.S. State Department encouraged it. Musician Louis Armstrong was sent to Nigeria. Duke Ellington went to Iraq. Dizzy Gillespie to Yugoslavia, and Benny Goodman to Moscow. The third day of the Riyadh Jazz Festival was cancelled due to heavy rains. Yet the moment represents a new page in jazz festival geography.
This festival shows that the leadership here wants to let the people open up, to see more things, more cultures.
Although the audience was segregated, there was a men's section, a women's section, and one for families. The festival was a historical moment for the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Daniel Campos, I-24 News.
Interesting. Are you a fan of jazz?
Well, I think I'm starting to be a fan of Mohammed bin Salman, to be honest, the Saudi Crown Prince. To your questions...
You know, I think there's a connection between jazz and bin Salman. I mean, his ability to improvise, right? It's been pretty remarkable.
Yeah, it's the Saudi desire to be less dependent on oil. Yeah. So it's just a huge overhaul of the entire economy, society. We're seeing this change happening gradually. The kingdom is opening itself to modernization with steps as allowing women to drive, letting women in sports stadiums, movie theaters, right, will be opened.
It's fascinating. One of the most interesting transformations on the planet right now. So, by the way, speaking of transformation, in Rome, dozens of people on this day took to the streets to enjoy a rare snowfall in the city, and even the priests at the Vatican got in at the action.
Apparently, Rome was hit with a rare winter storm this weekend.
That's right. The snowfall disrupted flights and shut down schools, but people did not seem to mind. Many took to the streets, visiting the famous fountains and breaking out even their skis. The dogs were also having fun, running around in the snow.
Even priests from the Vatican got in on the fun. They held a huge snowball fight in St. Peter's Square. The city was hit with nearly 2 inches of snow, which is a lot for the Mediterranean capital.
The storm was part of a major storm system moving across Europe. In one city in Hungary, people decided to have fun by sliding down an icy road. The storm has been dubbed the Beast from the East and saw temperatures across much of Europe fall to their lowest level this winter.
Well, you know, I was living in Berlin in 2013, and I remember that they said it was the hardest winter in 100 years. So now I'm starting to think maybe this
might be more hard.
Yeah. We have lots more coming up on Clear Cut with Michelle McQuarrie. Michelle, can we get a forecast?
Absolutely, Tal. Of course, we are following that crisis in Syria very closely at the top of the show. Russia has ordered a daily 5-hour pause in the Syrian government's assault on the rebel-held Ghouta area. But will this help ease the humanitarian crisis? And with more indications of chemical weapons use, at what point do other countries now step in? We will be discussing that. Also, China's President Xi Jinping may be setting himself up for indefinite rule. The Communist Party has proposed a change to the constitution that would abolish term limits, and that would essentially give Xi the authority to rule for life. We have the president of the America-China Public Affairs Institute joining us live in studio, Fred Tang, to discuss all of that and a lot more coming up on Clear Cut. Back to you guys.
Nice play on words there with forecast.
The forecast,
well
you
done.
It? Yeah,
well
I saw
done.
You were smiling. Well, David, you know, Monica Lewinsky is apparently back in the news. She wrote a new essay for Vanity Fair.
Lewinsky said the Me Too movement has forced her to confront the power dynamics of her 1990s affair with then-President Bill Clinton. Quote, now at 44, I'm just beginning to consider the implications of the power differentials that were so vast between a president and a White House intern. He was my boss. He was the most powerful man on the planet. He was 27 years my senior with enough life experience to know better. He was, at the time, at the pinnacle of his career, while I was in my first job out of college. I will say, Tal, this reflects an argument that so many people had with Bill Clinton, that Bill Clinton should have known better, right? He should have put a stop. But it's also very clear from the Star Report and from Monica Lewinsky's own testimony that she gave 20 years ago, she encouraged this. And maybe it was wrong of her and she shouldn't have done that. And maybe there's a valid argument that Bill Clinton should have been able to say, I don't want anything to do with this. but she was a willing participant.
But let me ask you this. You've been reporting this story for a whole year or so, right?
20 years. I led the Fox News coverage of the Monica Lewinsky scandal 20 years ago.
Can you see why now, in light of the Me Too movement, she might have new thoughts or a new perspective about what happened there?
Sure. And I think, again, it gets to the idea that Bill Clinton had a responsibility to put an end to it, but you can't put all of the blame for what they claimed was a consensual affair just on one person. You just can't do it.
And on this note...
That's right.
That does it for this hour of Crossroads.
Stay with us on 924 News. Much more ahead. We'll be right back.